Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, July the 9th, 2025. There is a Saturn-Neptune conjunction forming. I mean, they're getting very close together, these planets, and they don't make an exact conjunction this year, but I do think we need to start thinking about what this Saturn-Neptune conjunction actually means. Now, the exact conjunction is next year in February, but for the moment we need to be looking at these two planets and working out what impact they're having on us. So, one thing I want to look at in this video is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, even though it's not exact this year, and to consider what it might mean, what it's all about, and perhaps, what we can expect next year. But before I look at Saturn and Neptune in detail, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Wednesday, July the 9th, 2025. And, don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So here is the chart for today, Wednesday. And you can see that the moon is in early Capricorn. So at noon, New York time, the moon is at 3:42 Capricorn. And it went into Capricorn, well, London time, at 9:55 a.m., 5 to 10, which would be 5 to 11 on most of continental Europe. So that does represent a change. It is quite a big change. Moon in Sagittarius moving to sort of moon in Capricorn. And we had a very bouncy moon in Sagittarius in mutual reception to Jupiter. And now it's gone into an Earth sign, Capricorn, a sign where the moon is in its detriment because the moon rules Cancer. And additionally, when the moon moves into Capricorn, it tells us that we do now have the run up to the full moon. So tomorrow we've got a full moon at I think it's 18-19 Capricorn. So it's begun. And so moon is in Capricorn, opposite the sun in Cancer. And so perhaps we're starting to see the results of whatever was going on since the new moon. So the lunar cycle is changing. It's moving from waxing to waning, and so there are changes, and perhaps we're starting to see the truth of the matter, whatever that truth might be. And when you've got moon in Capricorn, sun in Cancer, there's always that tension between our own interests and our sensitivity, perhaps our sensitivity to other people. One moment being very warm and friendly, the next moment being brutally self-interested. That is how that new moon, that full moon can work. And the moon, when it moves into Capricorn, is making a square to Saturn and Neptune. So we've got moon square Saturn and moon square Neptune. So that might be a good reason why I've decided to look at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because there is a great Saturn-Neptune feel to today because of moon square Saturn, moon square Neptune. And it's quite a tough pair of aspects. Moon square Saturn can really restrict things we want to do, but we can't do them, and there can be fear. Yeah, sure, we would like to do stuff, but what if we were to do it? What would happen? And so those two aspects could be difficult. And then the moon goes on to make an opposition to Jupiter. So in fact, today we have a T-square. We've got moon opposition Jupiter with Saturn and Neptune on the T, and that does make today rather collective. We can think about what is happening in society, what's happening in the business cycle. We can look at the financial news, global markets, what people are worried about, and it's all very clear. And if we ourselves want to worry about where things are going, we certainly can. And one aspect that is perhaps different from the rest is a decile between Mercury and Jupiter. So Mercury is 36 degrees from Jupiter. It's 1/10 of the circle. And so with that Mercury decile Jupiter, we're trying to be optimistic here. We're trying to see things in the best possible light. And if we think that things can work, maybe they can. Maybe they really can. In spite of the environment, in spite of the seriousness of other people, if we really want to be happy, make things happen our way, it does seem that it can be done. But we need to be very, very optimistic, and we have got to direct our optimism. Sometimes optimism can be rather sloppy. It can be going all over the place, and we can sort of vaguely think that things are going to be fine. But that's not really a good approach. We have to have a plan, and we have to do what we can to make it happen. And it's just about having that belief. Jupiter is in many ways the planet of faith, and so with Mercury decile Jupiter, we can have the faith that our optimism really can be real. And so that's a picture for New York. Turning to Sydney, Australia. So this is noon set for Sydney. And of course, this kind of applies to New Zealand and East Asia as well. And so you can see that at noon, the moon is at 26 Sagittarius in Sydney. So if you are in Australia or New Zealand, then the moon doesn't actually move into Capricorn until fairly late in the day, 6 o'clock in the evening, maybe early, maybe even later. And so with moon in late Sagittarius, perhaps conjunct the galactic center, there may be quite a lot of optimism and a belief that that things are going to be fine, and also enthusiasm, and it's all looking good. And then the moon moves into Capricorn, so there might be a sudden change of pace, late afternoon or early evening, as the moon changes sign. So there is a bit of a difference, and I don't think if you are in Australasia, but you're really going to feel that moon in Capricorn. And don't forget that moon square Saturn, which I was quite negative about, a moon square Neptune. Perhaps that's more about late in the evening or into tomorrow. And then there is the heliocentric view, looking at things from the perspective of the sun. And so we have a conjunction between Venus and Saturn. That's today and possibly into tomorrow. These two planets are conjunct heliocentrically, and in fact they are making a sextile to Uranus. So Saturn is starting to make a sextile to Uranus. Don't forget, this is a heliocentric chart, so geocentrically it's true that Saturn is about to go retrograde. Heliocentrically, Saturn never goes retrograde, and so Saturn's applying to a sextile of Uranus. Venus is applying to a conjunction of Saturn. Venus is also applying to a sextile of Uranus, but I think it's that conjunction to Saturn that really matters. And so with that Venus conjunct Saturn, it might support the geocentric moon square Saturn. And so with Venus conjunct Saturn, things could be restrained, restricted, even repressed with Venus conjunct Saturn, and we might be, tempted to be, quite transactional in our views. What is the purpose of someone? Can they really help us? And if they can't help us, do we need to bother with them? So that's one approach. Additionally, it might be difficult to express the warmth of your feelings. Or you might observe that other people are finding it difficult to express their warmth. But you can see that with moon square Saturn geocentrically. You don't necessarily have to look at Venus conjunct Saturn heliocentrically. And Another aspect we've got is Mercury is making a quincunx to Jupiter. Now, that quincunx to Jupiter, again, it reflects what we know already from a geocentric chart, because geocentrically we've got Mercury decile Jupiter, and so the quincunx with Mercury, between Mercury and Jupiter, is kind of more of the same. It's trying to be enthusiastic. It's just trying to see things in the best possible light. And the question is, can we be successful? I mean, it could be hard work. I mean, it is a quincunx, but a bit of optimism, carefully directed, may not be such a bad thing. So now it's time to look at the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Wednesday, July the 9th, 2025. Aries. Aries, you are finding your feet. You feel that you know what you want to do, and so this means that you might be sort of more ambitious than usual. You're thinking about the challenges in front of you, and you don't really want to mess around. And so Aries, you could be quite tough, and of a view that really you're the person that can handle it. You can't really spend too much time trusting other people. It's all down to you. And such an approach, I would have said, is fairly reasonable. And if you are absolutely determined to do something, yeah, I think you can. And you may be now feeling the fact that Saturn is in your sign. And Saturn moving into Aries, okay, it does go retrograde at the end of the week, but still it's going to be in Aries for a bit of time. And so you could say that Saturn is a serious influence, and it's in your sign, so it is forcing you to ask serious questions, and also to ask, what are you all about? What do you want to achieve? And it's tough, but it's probably what you need. And with the moon in Capricorn making a square to Saturn, you can sort of ignore sort of extraneous emotions, concerns, feelings. You're not especially emotional at the moment, and the reason is probably one of priorities. You have got a list of priorities. Not necessarily a very Aries thing to have. Aries doesn't like lists, not particularly. Aries likes to be fairly spontaneous. But from a relative perspective, it's probably not one of your more spontaneous days, because you've got better things to do. You can't be all things to all people. You can't be everywhere at once. And so if you do want to really concentrate on things and make an impact, you certainly can. And in the process, there are things you might have to ignore. There might be, for example, pressure from your family, to sort of do things, pay attention to them. I mean, you have to pay some attention to them, but you can be disciplined. And yeah, I think that you can prioritize. And as far as other people are concerned, people seem okay up to a point, but how far can you go? They might, on the surface, seem to be reasonable and friendly, but then you find that this is not necessarily the case. And maybe it's about other people promising a lot, but not really being able to deliver. And in the end, you might be disappointed. But you'd only be disappointed if you were relying too much on any one person. If you take the view that it is down to you, that it's up to you to create results, and you don't get distracted, then I think that it can be a solid day. and in the end you can be well pleased with whatever it is that you have achieved. Taurus. Taurus, looking at the heliocentric chart, there's a conjunction between Venus and Saturn. And this conjunction to Venus-Saturn might say something about how you are presenting yourself, or at least how you would like to present yourself. You seem to be taking yourself fairly seriously. You believe that you have to do things, on your own, and getting close to any one person, it might just be hard work. And is it really going to be worth the effort? I think the answer, might be no, because if you try to be warm and friendly, you might not succeed. You might just not be in the mood, and so that says one thing about today, that you need to consider your own interests and perhaps work out where you are lacking. There are certain things you need to find out about, and you might know 75% of what you need to know, and it's quite result driven. So you want to know things for a reason. It's a practical reason, and so you can be very systematic about how you go about things, and you have to make sure that you don't get overwhelmed by irrelevant facts. You need to keep thinking about what you need to know, and if you do that, then I think that you will start to really home in on what matters. And also, like yesterday, Taurus, you're not satisfied. You really do believe that things could be better, and that things can improve, and you can improve. So you're looking at yourself and how well you're doing. I mean, it's fine up to a point, but you just know things could be better. And so that is quite possibly, a good thing. You don't want to be complacent, and it's not a time for complacency. And if you give things your best shot, then I think that you can be well pleased with what in the end you're able to achieve. But just remember, you don't have everything. You don't know everything, and so there is that drive for exploration. But it's not exploration just for the sake of it. It's absolutely got a reason. So as far as relationships are concerned, we can't help but notice that Venus-Saturn conjunction heliocentrically. So it just might be the case that you're not really in the mood for spending a lot of time with particular people. You've got your own priorities, your own things that you want to achieve, and if you were to try to spend time on relationships, unless there was a real purpose behind it, you might feel dissatisfied, and you might be quite critical. I mean, you could be critical. You can see that people have their faults. No one's perfect. So maybe today relationships should perhaps be de-emphasized. Gemini, you are feeling that things perhaps could be better. You're not entirely satisfied with the way things are going, and it just could be that you're asking too many questions. That is a problem with Gemini. I mean, Geminis can ask a lot, and one question leads to another question, and it can lead to a situation which is confusing, and you might have have doubts because you're asking too many questions. And, additionally, you have to take into account other people's sensitivities and, where you find yourself going. So you might find yourself moving into areas that you weren't really expecting. And it could be about the questions you ask, the people you meet, and you think that something is harmless, it's going nowhere, or going nowhere of any importance. But then suddenly you find you're dealing with a matter that is far more serious than you'd realized. And it is actually a day for stirring up hornets' nests. And you just might just find yourself in a place that you really shouldn't be, and it could be about stumbling into something that you weren't really thinking, and perhaps you were vaguely curious, and you ask one question too many, and you suddenly find that it's all a big mess. And we do have a square aspect between the Moon and Saturn today, and that this Moon-Saturn square could create complications with other people in your social life. Maybe you're just seeing things in a different way, and you can see people for what they really are, and you don't necessarily like what you see. Or it just could be something you say, and you feel that it's innocent enough. You notice something, you want to make a remark, and the reaction might be surprising. And we arguably get some support by the fact that Venus and Uranus are quite close to a conjunction. There is a Venus-Uranus conjunction in Gemini, which is of course your sign. And so with that Venus-Uranus conjunction, there's just something about your presence, the way you present yourself, that really could stir things up. Now, that could be fun, it could be exciting, but in certain quarters it might be rather disturbing. Now, one aspect that that we do have today, there are actually two interesting aspects involving Mercury, which is your ruler. We do have Mercury semi-sextile Mars. It's because so Mercury is at 1247 Leo at noon in New York, and Mars is at 1250 Virgo. So there is that relationship between Mercury and Mars, and it perhaps goes back to what I was saying about what you say. There is certainly something you want to say, but because it's Mercury semi-sextile Mars, in your struggle to say something, to say the right thing, you could say completely the wrong thing. And it might just be the harder you try, the more difficult it is. And so, do be careful. Geminis, they think a lot, but sometimes Geminis can be blissfully unaware, especially in the emotional department, or maybe I'm just talking for myself with the Sun in Gemini, with my Sun in Gemini. And, additionally, we have a decile between Mercury and Jupiter, they're 36 degrees apart. And now that could be a positive aspect. And this is an aspect that you could perhaps use. So Mercury is making a 36-degree aspect to Jupiter, and remember, Jupiter is in a great position. It's in Cancer, it's exalted, and so somehow you have to look beyond the trivia, all the stuff that you're bothered about, the stuff that you're trying to deal with, and it might just be annoying, and you find you have to take things too seriously. You don't really want to take things seriously, but you have to. And perhaps what you're lacking is vision. And this can be a Gemini problem. And speaking as a Gemini, not having a vision. You're just focusing on things on too low a level and not seeing the broad picture. And so Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter Mercury quintile Jupiter is the struggle to find a vision. There's a vision out there. All these things you're thinking about, all your experiences, and just putting it together and being able to see the whole. And that's something that you need to really work on today. And if you do have the sort of a mental sort of self-discipline, and it can be hard, it can be really hard to bring all the strands together. Can you be bothered? But if you can be bothered, at some stage in a day, something might click and you understand what it's all about, and you'll know what you need to do next. Cancer. Cancer, it's not necessarily going to be a great day. It kind of depends. And the temptation might be to think about your surroundings and who is there, who do you need to deal with. And it does seem to be the case that there are people you need to interact with, and you need to take into account other people's views, other people's opinions. But the moon is going into Capricorn, so that does mean we've got a build up to a full moon. And so tomorrow we've got the full moon, and it being a full moon, Cancerians are very likely to be impacted. And so the full moon has definitely started, and there is a possibility that if you spend too much time thinking about other people, worrying about other people, trying to take them into consideration, then they might trip you up or they might hold you back. And it might be a case where the responsible thing to do isn't necessarily the right thing to do. When I say responsible, I mean what feels like being the responsible thing to do. So the responsible thing to do, for example, might be to inform everyone, to keep people abreast of what your plans are, what your next move is, the way you're thinking about things. But the trouble is that if you were to do that, you might get negative feedback, which is of no value. And other people might interfere. They might tell you that you can't do something. They might just not be helpful. And so it might be a situation where the right thing to do, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And in fact, you should keep quiet. You don't want to give people a chance to complain or to criticize you. And that might be the nature of this hard aspect between the moon and Saturn. And this especially applies if you're working, or if you're running a business, or you're trying to do something that gets wider attention. You need to be an individual. You need to work on things in your own way. And if you bring people in and you try to tell them what you're doing, it just might bring everything to a standstill, and that is really not what you want. And so this may say something about relationships in general. Moon square Saturn can be a tough aspect, and it may occur to you that you and some people are not necessarily on the same wavelength, especially now when remember, Saturn is about to go retrograde. Saturn goes retrograde, I think, over the weekend. And in the Cancerian chart, Saturn does say a lot about relationships, about the other person. And it could be another person who, for example, might be changing their mind or might be indecisive. And they might encourage you to be indecisive. They might question what you're doing. And so other people should be treated with caution, whoever they are. And especially now with Moon square Saturn, you just might not get what you want, get what you're expecting. And it is difficult because you do feel that you should be taking other people into consideration. And really, you should take other people into consideration in the sense of trying to understand what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and what they're planning. But I'm just suggesting maybe it's not a good day for placing too much trust in another person, and you don't want to give someone an opportunity to block your progress. But Sometimes advice is required. It may be that you're planning on doing something which is really stupid, and in which case it would be good if you got some advice, if you got a second opinion. So, you do have to evaluate the situation. But there are other times when you're right. Which you're a Cancerian, and Cancerians do have those moments of just being absolutely sure they're doing the right thing. And if you really are sure, and you're 100% sure, why complicate things by being unnecessarily open about your plans and your intentions? Leo, it does feel tough at the moment, that everything is going to take a lot of work, that you can't take anything for granted. And so that just may say something about your attitude. Leo, does have a reputation for being quite easygoing, and being able to maybe use its natural power. Sun in Leo. If you're a Sun in Leo, if you're coming from these horoscopes from a perspective of the Sun in Leo, of course you've got the Sun in its own sign. Of course, if you've got Leo rising or Moon in Leo, perhaps that kind of strength isn't there. But there's still a great confidence there. But right now, it does seem difficult. That if you want something to happen, you might have to fight for it, and give it everything you've got. And you can't just assume that things are just going to change, all by themselves, because that is not necessarily the case. And it really could be that you need to use a fairly sort of incredible amount of force to get anything done. But of course you don't want to use too much force, because you just might break things. And once you break things, how are you going to be able to sort of put them together? And so what is to be done? Well, Leo, it just might be a good idea to just take things one step at a time. Don't feel that you're going to sort everything out in one big dramatic move. Decide what the first step is, and just be quite systematic about it. One step needs to be done. There will be opposition. I think that opposition might come from other people, or you might be wondering, why you're doing it, and that could be a problem. So if you're doing a series of rather tedious tasks, there will be this tension there. You'll be asking, what is the point? And it's so perhaps boring that you'd rather be doing something else, and it could be a struggle. And maybe it's a time, Leo, where really you shouldn't think too much, because if you do think too much, you might just ask too many questions, and that might not be great. And perhaps you also have to think beyond what you're doing. It's easy to think that you're doing something which is got no rewards. You're doing it sort of pro forma, but for what reason? And so there is an existential issue there. So what you kind of have to do, Leo, is try to think beyond the situation. Think, where is it actually going in the end? And that requires some sort of concentrated optimism, somehow trying to be optimistic about everything, but in a very solid and grounded kind of way, seeing how things could really flower if you gave them a chance. And if something seems boring, maybe you should just see it, as like sowing seeds. You sow seeds, and there are no immediate benefits. You have to wait, and with that disciplined approach, in the end, you can create the preparations for the future. Remembering that the sun is at 1742 Cancer. So in less than a fortnight, the sun will be moving into Leo, into your sign, whether it's your rising sign or your moon sign or your sun sign. So that is about to happen. And so, yeah, maybe with this full moon, because we've got a full moon coming up tomorrow, the full moon is about preparation, and it might not be exciting. You may wonder what the whole purpose is, but just keep going. And yeah, if you want to create some kind of dramatic change, you probably can. But on the other hand, it just might be about some sort of inner tension. You feel that you have to break through, you have to smash a slab of concrete to resolve a situation. But it just is possible that you're being melodramatic. Virgo. It's important to have a positive approach. Things can happen, and you don't have to worry too much about the past and perhaps responsibilities you might feel to other people and perhaps other organizations. Today should be about what you want to do and what you can achieve, and also what you enjoy doing. So Virgo, don't have doubts and don't allow yourself to be tripped up by other people and their demands, maybe even their sort of moral blackmail. Okay, that's perhaps an exaggeration, but you don't need to feel guilty about doing what you want to do. And so if there's something that you enjoy doing, that you feel is useful for yourself and your prospects, then really give it your best shot. And don't worry about having fantasies. When I say fantasies, I'm talking about having ideas about what could be. On the surface, these ideas might seem to be completely unrealistic, but if you give it some thought, Virgo, then you might start to see things in a different way. You might start to see possibilities where in the past none had existed. And why weren't there possibilities in the past? Well, it just could have been a failure of imagination. But right now, Virgo, I think your imagination is on very good form. And so if you're starting to think about how something could be possible, then keep thinking about it. Okay, you can't think forever, but from thoughts lead to a plan, and then you can start to make things happen. And so just because something seems unrealistic doesn't actually mean that it is unrealistic, and you just shouldn't allow fear to get in your way. Okay, that could happen. The moon in Capricorn is making a square to Saturn, square to Neptune, but that is something that affects all of us, regardless of our sign, but it needn't affect you specifically. And if you can get over those fears and really start to believe in yourself and to believe that if you have an idea, then that idea exists for a reason. It didn't just bump into you as some random process and it's just going to go away and it's just there to confuse you. No, ideas happen for a reason, and they're there for you to move things on, to the next level. And additionally, do think about other people and their role in your life. And just because you and another person don't entirely get on doesn't mean to say there can't be progress. So, yeah, if you have ideas about how you and another person can relate, it's possible that your ideas can actually happen. And so try to be optimistic about relationships, the various and many relationships in your life. Just because a relationship hasn't worked in the past doesn't mean to say it's not going to work in the future. And it could be that today, as far as relationships are concerned, that you should be thinking about incompatibility and what incompatibility means. Is an incompatibility something permanent, or is it something that has developed recently? Or indeed, is it a challenge? You can't have the same priorities as everyone, and perhaps you need to realize that someone with different priorities than you can actually be complementary. So if you have vision and optimism, then I think it's a day when relationships really can work for you, and they can work on your terms. And so, given all of that, Virgo, it's very important that you don't get frustrated. You might feel at times where things aren't happening, and that it might be someone else's fault, and that might lead to sort of negative feelings, and feelings that are unreasonable and are quite sort of cutting feelings. Feeling that something is damaging you, something is damaging someone else, and that's not really a positive place to be in. But it is unnecessary. And if you give your imagination and you give your fantasies free rein within reason, then in the end you can start to see things really starting to move. And I think they will start to move in a very positive way. Libra, there is this question about whether actually you do need to do anything, because I think that in most cases you're going to be happiest when you are undisturbed. Sometimes it just feels like that. Things just get to be too much, and you're thinking about your own interests, and that's absolutely fine. And so, ideally, Libra, today you should be sort of gravitating towards places where you feel comfortable, places which have worked for you in the past. And that doesn't apply just to places. It's also about people. Familiarity is something that is sometimes underestimated. Familiarity does matter, and if you are in a familiar environment, it's quite likely that you're going to function on sort of top form. So don't feel that you have to go on wild adventures, and don't allow yourself to be pressurized. You could be pressurized. You might be told that you have to do something, or it might be suggested that you have to do something, and that you shouldn't be complacent, you shouldn't be too comfortable, because there's always something that needs to be done. So if you do feel that kind of pressure, I would suggest that you just find a way of ignoring it. I mean, not 100% ignoring it. You can acknowledge the pressure without actually giving into it, and then you can start to focus on yourself and on your priorities, and in your own quiet way, if you're given the quietness you need and perhaps deserve as well, then I think Libra, you can make things happen, again, in a quiet way. It doesn't have to be advertised. And additionally, Libra, there may be a couple of areas where you feel that things could be better, that perhaps you haven't given it enough energy in the past, or maybe even you've been lazy or negligent. And today, and perhaps tomorrow as well, you can make up for lost time. And if you're doing something that is quiet, undisturbed and constructive, then what you're doing is you're working on yourself. And as you work on yourself, you see improvement. And so it's almost like you might have to withdraw in a sort of caterpillar way, turning into a chrysalis even, and just be developing on what needs to be developed. And then sooner or later, then you can emerge as a sort of your new self, and you can start to take on the world and its challenges. But short term, Libra, I'm not convinced that there is anything that needs to be done in terms of the outside world and outside pressures. And I think that in the vast majority of cases, outside pressures can be politely ignored. Scorpio, you would like to say something. It's important to you. And the question then is, can you say it? Because as far as you're concerned, there is opposition, and not everyone is on your wavelength. And if you're concerned that people are not on your wavelength, then you have this question: are they going to listen to you? Maybe not. I mean, that is always a risk you're taking, especially now as we're approaching the full moon. So tomorrow is the full moon, and you can feel the full moon. Moon is now in Capricorn, starting to make an opposition to the sun in Cancer, and so with the full moon, it seems that something does have to be said now, because it's reaching a moment of decision, perhaps a moment of choice, and if you don't speak up very soon, well, you might have lost your chance. But what is actually holding you? What is holding you back? And it may not just be about your words. It could be about your various duties and obligations. You feel there are a lot of things that you're supposed to be doing, and if you're supposed to be doing them, then you can't do other things. You can't waste time talking to other people, telling people how you feel, and it may even be the case that it's just easier at some level to just move from one task to the next, not ask any questions, and just get through the day. And that just doesn't strike me as being an especially good approach. And you have to ask, why are you doing what you're doing? And it maybe there is a need to ask questions, because when you start asking questions, you might realize that someone has got something wrong. You've been working on a particular set of assumptions, and those assumptions may be incorrect. So you've got the full moon coming up, and the full moon will show you. Perhaps the full moon will demonstrate that there are certain things you've taken for granted, and you thought they were true, but actually they are, okay, they might not be false, but they might only be half true, and there's more information that you need to uncover. And as far as other people are concerned, other people are helpful, but only up to a point. They're helpful if it doesn't inconvenience them. And that is a reminder, you've got the moon in Capricorn. That is very moon in Capricorn. Moon in Capricorn is not going to be unfriendly in itself, but it's not going to put itself out in such a way that it might compromise its own selfish interests. So other people will, they'll give you a bit, they'll give you what they can afford to give you, but there'll come a point where they just close down. And so don't ask for too much, and just try to be aware of the limits of the situation. And that does mean that you shouldn't be too reliant on any one person, because they can only help you up to a point. And in the end, it is down to you, but you'd still need to ask questions. People might not want to answer your questions, but if you ask those questions in a way that is sincere but firm, I think you will get the answers you're looking for. And when you get those answers, you might be in a position to make a reevaluation. And it's at that point that you might realize that someone's made a false assumption. It could be you, it could be someone else. And what you don't want to be doing is wasting your time. And there's just is a danger that you waste your time if you don't say anything. So if something has to be said, well, make sure you say it. But as far as other people are concerned, there's only so much that they are prepared to give. Sagittarius, it's not necessarily the most exciting day. at least as far as the external world is concerned. But that doesn't mean to say it can't be an exciting day in terms of your inner reality. And so maybe, Sagittarius, you should make a distinction. I know that all of us are social beings, and that, you can't look at a person in isolation. And that's certainly a valuable approach. You've got to study social psychology, but there is that distinction between the individual and society. And today, I think you need to treat yourself as an individual. And as far as possible, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you are reliant on other people, other people's whims. And yeah, that could be hard because, Uranus has now moved into Gemini, and with Uranus moving into Gemini, you can perhaps see how other people can mess things up for you. You can see how exciting it can be. And of course, you've also got Venus conjunct Uranus in Gemini. And so, yes, you are aware of the impact of the external world. But if you want to have a great day, then it's you that matters. And it's your own perceptions that matter. It's also, your own plans, your own ideas. And you shouldn't be worried about social validation. It's nice to be praised. It's nice to be supported. It's nice when people make helpful suggestions. But you don't need any of that today. It should be primarily about you and enjoying being yourself and enjoying your own freedom. Though I can't say that is 100% of the case, but simply because there is a semi-sextile between Mercury and, there's a semi-sextile between Mercury and Mars, and there's a quintile between Mercury and Jupiter. So, both those aspects are important. And, okay, Mercury semi-sextile Mars is perhaps more about other people and how they interact, how they appear to interact, and it's about other people's tension. Whereas Mercury decile Jupiter, that's what the aspect is. It's about how you forge relations with other people, and it's not always easy, as I think I've suggested so far. Other people can be a problem, and they can make your life miserable, and they can distract you. And if you spend too much time thinking about other people, you're unlikely to get anywhere. And if you think about yourself, then that is the right way of handling today. And with Mercury decile Jupiter, you can think about what you actually want from other people. Think about what you want. Be selfish about it, and have an idea about what you can get from other people. And in that way, you may be able to make the connections that matter. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and you may need to really exercise your will and make sure that you really get what you want. And if you think that something is possible, yes, then it can be possible. But you are going to have to sort of put in the work, and not just the work as in physical work, as in putting things together, moving, spending time. It's more about the mental work and having the conviction that you can have an impact and that you can be influential. Capricorn, the moon is changing signs. It's moving from Sagittarius into Capricorn, your sign. And so moon moving into Capricorn, that's always good news if you're a Capricorn. It does allow you to relate to everything around you, and you feel that you are, you're in the right place, and you feel comfortable, and that's always good. And you understand what's happening, and that is really good, because if you don't understand what's happening, then how can you make good decisions, and how can you really make the most of who you are. But the moon, when it moves into Capricorn, it does make a square to Saturn, and it makes a square to Neptune, and that moon square Saturn may make you think that something is holding you back. There are things you want. You want to handle things in a particular way, and there's a clash somewhere. And what is it? And it could be that there are some people you don't entirely get on with, and if you have a lot of people around, then that could be irritating. In fact, Capricorn, it doesn't take much today to make you irritated, and things are intensified by the fact that we now have a build up to a full moon. The moon has gone into Capricorn. We've got a full moon in Capricorn tomorrow, and this is reminding you of how you get on with people, or indeed whether you get on with them. And there is a lot of tension here. In fact, we've got a T-square. We've got Moon making an opposition to Jupiter, and yes, we've got the Moon making a square to Saturn and a square to Neptune. So the question is, how do you actually resolve this T-square? And the resolution seems to be Saturn itself, because you've got Moon opposition Jupiter, and then you've got Saturn on the T. So Moon opposition Jupiter could be external pressure, things happening on the outside that you don't really like, that you find to be distracting. So what is the resolution? Saturn is in Aries, and the resolution is about you being tough and firm and believing in yourself and not feeling that you have to do anything. If you know for sure that you don't have to do anything, then it's much easier to deal with outside pressure. So if someone is annoying, but they can't do anything to you, they can't make you do anything you don't want to do, then you can deal with those annoyances, and you can be reasonable about it. You don't have to get angry. You only get angry if you think there's a possibility that someone might actually be able to threaten you. Threaten your peace of mind. They might be trying to force you to do something you don't want to do. That's when you get annoyed. That's when you become defensive. But in fact, there's no reason to be defensive, because you can be confident that you're able to hold your ground. And another thing to say is that, heliocentrically, we've got Venus making a conjunction to Saturn, and at the same time, we've got the Moon moving through Capricorn. And it could be that someone is trying to get your attention. Now, that doesn't mean that you should ignore them. Some people need to be attended to. You need to listen to what they're saying. Maybe they're in trouble. Maybe you can help them. That doesn't mean to say you have to drop everything and spend a whole day looking after another person's problem. Just acknowledge someone's existence, and that mere acknowledgement may be enough. And also, when you acknowledge someone's existence, they may respond in a way that is unexpected, and they may respond in a way that is actually sympathetic to your own needs. So as far as other people are concerned, don't assume a conflict, and do have sufficient confidence to know that no one can really get in your way. No one can disrupt your peace of mind, well, unless you let them. But you are well placed, and you are firmly placed. And once you realize that, then I think that you can take a calm approach and feel very confident. And as a result, I think that today can be just fine. Aquarius. Over the last couple of days, astrologically, there hasn't been a great deal going on, and that's been reflected in what I've been saying in my forecasts of the 12 signs. but things are slowly starting to hot up. We do tomorrow have a full moon, which I'll be talking about at length in my video for Thursday. And as far as you're concerned, you are maybe becoming aware that the temperature is going up, and so what are you doing about it? And some Aquarians may feel that the best approach is to lay low. I mean, why take the risk? And it's not just about risk. You don't want to be bothered and have to deal with stuff that is just not worth it, too complicated. And it might be a good time to sort of fade into the background. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Though, to what extent can you entirely disappear? It may be hard work disappearing. The moon is making a square to Saturn, the moon is making a square to Neptune. So, whatever you're doing, there are still things to be said, things to listen to, and you can't shut out the world entirely. And whenever you hear something, whenever you get a piece of information, inevitably it's going to have an impact on you. And that might be the nature of the moon square Saturn and the moon square Neptune. So what do you do? And many Aquarians may feel they have to do something. You can't just watch as things unfold, and so you're perhaps feeling slightly torn there. Yet it does appear, Aquarius, that if you want to make an impact, you certainly can, and you have ideas. I mean, Aquarians always have ideas, and you have ideas about the way things should be, the way things should progress, and if you feel that something has to be done, then Aquarius, you're going to be able to do it, and you're going to be able to come over as a fairly strong and authoritative figure who really does need to be taken seriously. And you can take your resources, whatever those resources might be, and you can sort of forge them into something really very powerful. So you have everything you need to have a great impact, if that is something that you want to do. And the tension, may be increased by the attitude of other people, whoever those other people might be, because a lot of people are under pressure, or seem to give the impression that something has to really change. And we're not talking about gradual change, it's dramatic change. And so try to understand what's bothering people. Maybe people who are very close to you, they do feel pressurized. I don't know whether it's anything personal, but it could just be about the world in which we're living. And people do take things seriously. They take things seriously that really there's nothing they can do about, but they still want to go on and on about it. And so that might be about what's happening today and tomorrow, and the political and social climate may be impacting you, or if it's not impacting you, it may be impacting other people, and that might in turn be impacting you. So that's the kind of day it is, and that's why I suggested that it might be best if you just lay low. I think if you try to be active and you try to really sort of be there, and you feel that you want to be in the center of things, it could be really tough. But maybe you are tough. Maybe you're in a position where you feel that you can create the kind of dramatic change that I was talking about. But I think that most Aquarians are not going to be in the mood for that. So perhaps you should think about today and tomorrow, and just not not overexpose yourself to unnecessary pressure. Yeah, and remember we've got the full moon tomorrow, and the full moon is just is kind of more pressure, isn't it? And realizations. There are things that you might realize about yourself and about others, and that's all part of the full moon process. But you don't want to over dramatize, and so Aquarius, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed by it all. And if you want to do nothing, that's probably okay. Pisces, it would be nice if you could just be yourself, be with other people, enjoy other people's company. There is something, Pisces, about you, but it is sociable, and you've got lots to say, and you perhaps want to catch up with what other people are doing, and so that all seems very straightforward. Unfortunately, there is a square aspect between the moon and Saturn, and this moon-Saturn square, all of us are going to feel it to some extent, but this moon-Saturn square just might make it difficult to get on with certain people. There's just pressure, and the pressure, might relate to factors, such as money or some other detail that you don't want to bother with, they don't want to bother with, but somehow you have to bother with it, and that is almost the nature of the social interaction. So you might be prepared to just talk about nothing in particular. Even the other person might be prepared to talk about nothing in particular, but somehow the conversation comes round to serious matters. Yeah, it could be money, it could be something else, and that does make the whole thing, rather unsatisfactory. So unfocused socializing should probably be avoided, because it might suddenly become focused, and the focus might not be what you were actually looking for. Now, on a positive note, Pisces, your mind is actually very busy. There's a lot going on in your mind, and you're able to think forward, you're able to think ahead, and you're able to think about what is possible. And you might want to talk to other people about what is possible, but as I've already indicated, when you start to socialize too much, even if you're doing your best and you're coming up with wonderful ideas, it might just not be appreciated for one reason or another. And so maybe, Pisces, it's a day when you should be thinking about yourself and your own ideas, and thinking about how you can, bring these ideas together, because there is something very exciting about it. Though I suspect that at least one person is on your wavelength and will appreciate what you're saying, and this links to relationships. Relationships today could be problematic if you're dealing with people you don't really know very well. But if you're dealing with someone you know and trust, then it is a different picture. Okay, there might have been recent issues, but with Mercury making a semi-sextile to Jupiter, there is a way of dealing with them. Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, sorry, not Mercury semi-sextile, let's start again. Mercury decile Jupiter. Mercury decile Jupiter, you can see the links between yourself and another person. You can see how you're connected, but also that it requires work. And the question is, who deserves that kind of work? So you can't just spend ages trying to get on with someone who just doesn't appreciate you. But some people have the potential to really appreciate you with this Mercury decile Jupiter. And it just requires you to see the possibilities, to see how you can relate to another person. And perhaps you're dealing with someone who you've related in in a couple of different ways, but there's one way in which you haven't yet related. And this may be just a new link, a new possibility for compatibility that you need to work on. And so if you can work on it and you can be optimistic about it and be constructive about it, then it's possible, but despite everything, there's at least one relationship in your life that can be strengthened, and it will be strengthened, as an act of will on your part. And those are my forecasts of the 12 signs, and it's now time to look at the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 31, which is influence. It's how we have an influence on others. We can have an influence. And, when I've gone through the 12 signs, I've mentioned relationships quite a lot, and I've talked about how we might try our hardest to find areas of compatibility, and part of that is to do with the fact that we've got a decile between Mercury and Jupiter, and so with this Mercury-Jupiter decile, we've got ideas about the way we can get on with other people, indeed how we might be able to influence them, but are we able to really make it happen? And this is perhaps what this hexagram is asking. And the message of this hexagram 31 influence is that it's all about how we are moving. Greg Wynkoop, in his translation of the I Ching, he talks about this hexagram as being about movement. We are moving, and the question is, what are we moving, and how successful are we in terms of our movement? And sometimes it's possible to go too fast, and the third line is moving, and so because the third line is moving, there might be an area where we think we can have an influence, but we don't. We try our hardest. Perhaps we try to be friendly. We try to initiate a contact, and we quickly realize it hasn't worked out. So don't try to influence people just for the sake of it. Don't feel that just because internally you feel good about yourself and you've got something important to say, don't feel that it's necessarily going to be reciprocated. And we do get this idea that some kind of social advance, we're halfway through it and we just get stopped. It just comes to a grinding halt. And that might be connected with the fact that heliocentrically we got Venus conjunct Saturn. So Venus is about trying to have an influence, and then Saturn just stops it in its tracks. And so don't try too hard. But third line moves, so the hexagram we move to is more optimistic, and what we move to is hexagram number 45, which is gathering together. And that is about people coming together. It's about perhaps people gravitating around a leader, some strong figure. That strong figure could be you, but it needn't be you. Could be someone else. So these two hexagrams are about other people and about social development and how we try to have an influence, have an impact, and it's not easy. And if we take things too far, we could embarrass ourselves. But in the end, it's all about coming together with people, and perhaps you shouldn't be trying too hard to have an influence. It's just enough to be with people, gathering around a concept or an idea. It could be about a person, and if you can do that, then I think that you'll get it right. So socially today is quite active, and you have to make sure that you get your timing right. And if you do get your timing right, then I think by the end of the day, you might feel that you're not alone, and that you can be part of something which can be useful. And now I want to consider Saturn and Neptune. And in a way, you could say this is a bit of a preview, because the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction, is not exact until next year. So let's look at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So I'm not going to show you a chart of the precise moment that Saturn and Neptune are conjunct in 2025, because there isn't a precise moment. But what we can say is that Saturn and Neptune are getting very, very close to one another. So you can see that today, Wednesday, they're 15 minutes apart. And over the next couple of weeks, they get closer and closer apart. And I think they get to within about 12 arc minutes. And then Saturn goes retrograde, Neptune goes retrograde, because Saturn doesn't actually catch up with Neptune before it goes retrograde. And then they start to separate. But I do think that they're close enough for us to feel their effect. And so, what is Saturn Neptune about? Well, I wanted to start off by considering it from a theoretical view, not looking at past events. And if you're looking at a planetary pair theoretically, it's always a good idea to get an objective view. And that's why I do like Reinhold Ebertin's combination of stellar influences. And the good thing about Reinhold Ebertin, his combination of stellar influences, it really is a book I would recommend that anyone serious about astrology does get hold of, is that he is quite brief. He doesn't go on and on and on about what Saturn Neptune means. He just he does it all in a few sentences, in a few keywords. And so looking at what Reinhold Ebertin says about the Saturn Neptune pair, he's quite negative about it. I mean, I get the impression, seems to regard Saturn and Neptune as fairly malefic, and I think that I would agree with that. I don't think, well, Saturn is a malefic. Neptune's influence, like it or not, tends to be bad rather than good, usually. I mean, there are always exceptions. And so with Saturn and Neptune, Reinhold Ebertin says that the principle of Saturn and Neptune is about suffering, renunciation, and, let me pronounce this right, ascetism. No, I've got ascetism. Ascetic is like the hermit, the monk who perhaps separates him or herself from society and renounces pleasure. So that could be one aspect of Saturn and Neptune. And on a positive note, Ebertin says that Saturn and Neptune relates to sacrifice, being ready for sacrifice, and of course compassion, looking after other people, taking care of other people. And there is a fear aspect to Saturn and Neptune, and that can be something positive. We realize that things could go wrong, and so Ebertin talks about cautiousness and foresight as positive things to say about Saturn and Neptune. And sort of on a more negative note, it's about the clash between what he calls the lower and the higher. Now, you might say higher with Neptune is wanting to transcend. Neptune wants to overcome boundaries, and one of the boundaries is getting obsessed about the material world and wanting to move on to something else. And we might think about sort of immortality, becoming part of a whole, part of a collective. But Saturn is about barriers, it's about discipline, it's about what is down here. There's something very material about Saturn. We would love to let go, but we can't let go because Saturn can't handle it. Saturn wants to keep everything together. And he talks about the conjunction about Saturn and Neptune. He says a peculiar character, and I suppose he's talking about it's in a natal chart, a strong preoccupation with oneself, a struggle between idealistic and materialistic tendencies. So that is kind of an objective view about Saturn and Neptune. And these are two sort of these are two outer planets, and yeah, I think that Neptune wants to transcend, and Saturn kind of wants to do the opposite. And Saturn is terrified of transcending. And with Saturn and Neptune, you can think of perhaps Canute, King Canute. He was this sort of ancient sort of English king, and I think his subjects, according to the story, I don't know if the story is true or not, but his subjects were sort of telling him how all-powerful he was and how wonderful he was, and he wanted to demonstrate that this was not the case. So he had his throne brought to the tide, and he sat on his throne and he sort of watched the tide come in. And even though he was king, you could say Saturn. In the end, the tide went up, and he did this to demonstrate to his subjects that even the king couldn't stop the tide. And so Neptune, you might say, will always sort of overwhelm Saturn, and Saturn is then about the structures we are trying to create. So when we look at what's happening with this Saturn Neptune that we're feeling is so close to us, gets really close but doesn't exactly get there. It's about looking at everything that we believe in, and it's all being threatened. And one big news story, for example, over the last few weeks, people have just got absolutely obsessed about AI and how 30% of jobs for new graduates are going to be eliminated. White collar jobs are going to be removed. It's already happening. And so, that could be Saturn, Neptune. Okay, Neptune, you don't normally associate Neptune with AI, but instead it's some dramatic external force that is just threatening us. And, other people will have different priorities. I'm not going to make a special comment about climate change, but some people are looking at what the climate can do. Again, it's a concern. I'm not saying that man-made climate change works or doesn't work, but there is that perception that everything we build can be devastated, destroyed, removed. And when we look at the flooding in central Texas, that is a very Saturn-Neptune event. And as I said in yesterday's video, over the weekend, Neptune was going retrograde. That Saturn-Neptune conjunction was very close to the United States' IC, and so that is the foundations of the country. And so that flooding in Texas is perhaps a symbol, and a symbol of what the conjunction is all about. However much we care about things, we care about the structures we build, it's possible that they can just all be removed. And so that is perhaps what we can look forward to. Next year, when that Saturn-Neptune conjunction really does become exact. Now, the question is, where is this likely to happen? And so, certain countries potentially seem to be more impacted by the Saturn-Neptune cycle than others. One country that you could argue is strongly connected with Saturn-Neptune would be the Soviet Union and communism. So when was the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction? Well, the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction was in 1989, on November the 13th, 1989, and so this represented the fall of communism across Eastern Europe, and so a few days later you had the I think it started on November the 17th, 4 days after the Saturn-Neptune, could be exact, Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1989. You had the start of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and where the structure of communist control over Eastern Europe just faded away, and it was, in the end, certainly in Czechoslovakia, it wasn't very violent. It just you had one regime just shifted into another. In Romania, it was violent. Here's a horoscope of Ceausescu's death. Now, this happened the month after the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I mean, I remember watching all of those revolution changes in Eastern Europe happening. Every country had its different path, and of course, because Romania was one of the most totalitarian countries in Eastern Europe, and so this is when the chart of Ceausescu and his wife getting shot, and there you can see that there's a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. So you might then say, well, 1989 was a big blow to Russian power. So the Soviet Union really lost all its satellite states, and everything was just overcome. You had the structure Saturn being just knocked down, and if you go back to the previous Saturn-Neptune conjunction, likewise that was important for Russia and the Soviet Union. This was on sort of July the 22nd, 1953. And so July 22nd, 1953, Stalin died in March 1953. So you could say that this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, it didn't represent the end of the Soviet Union, but it did represent a crisis in the Soviet Union. It might not have been immediately apparent. Okay, just because Stalin died didn't mean everything immediately changed. And it took a couple of years before Khrushchev made his sort of secret speech criticizing Stalin. But it was a big change. Stalin dying, and now Stalin had been dead for a few months, so maybe we shouldn't be thinking about the exact moment. I mean, looking at the moment that Stalin died. So here's Stalin's death. Stalin died on March the 5th, 1953. So this is the time Stalin died. But still, there was a reasonably close Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Saturn-Neptune were conjunct within about 3 degrees. So this sort of fits with the idea that something had changed. Saturn, you could say Saturn is the great leader being overwhelmed by the inevitability of death. And then the previous Saturn-Neptune conjunction, before that, was in 1917. So here is the 1917 Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and I've sort of set this for Moscow. And of course, August the 1st, 1917. Well, a few months later, it was in the middle of a revolution, because you had the February Revolution and you had the October Revolution in 1917. So this is another example of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction having a huge impact on Russia. So the 1917, 1953, 1989, all of those 3 conjunctions have had an impact on Russia. So the question is, what is going to happen next year? How is this going to impact Russia? So if you are a Russophobe, there are sort of many Russophobes out there who believe that Russia in the end is going to collapse, that you really do believe that they're losing the war in Ukraine, well, you would probably regard that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, with optimism, that maybe this is bad news for Russia, that things are sort of unexpectedly going to go wrong if history repeats itself. I mean, that is one view. But I would have thought you'd be expecting some warnings. And I think that, Russia is almost certainly going to change. Something is going to change in Russia with this Saturn-Neptune conjunction if history repeats itself. But, Stalin dying did not lead to the end of the Soviet Union. And, likewise, 1989, we didn't have a Russian leader dying, but something is changing. And this does require further thought about whether or not it's going to keep going. But it just could be a situation where we had 3 Saturn-Neptune conjunctions in a row, 1979, 1953 and 1989, that all had an impact on Russia. But this conjunction is about something else. But the theme might remain the same. Saturn-Neptune is about structures falling apart. And that might not be Russia. It could be somewhere else. It might be, maybe the focus has switched to the European Union, maybe. The European Union has its structures and it's under pressure. It could be Britain, it could be anywhere, but we need to think about structures which are vulnerable, which are creaking, which have got old and are no longer able to keep back the tide of change. And so that's how we think, how we perhaps should be thinking about this conjunction between Saturn and Neptune. And the Saturn Neptune conjunction in the early 50s. I mean, if you think about what was happening, one event that took place at the time of the Saturn Neptune conjunction was the first hydrogen bomb. So that was on October the 31st, 1952. This was just before Stalin died, the autumn before Stalin died, and there you can see Saturn and Neptune are just a couple of degrees apart. And so in terms of the nuclear age, I mean, Saturn and Neptune, and you think about fear, and that is one aspect of Saturn and Neptune. And in fact, talking about fear, and it may be about cycles of fear, because from the early 50s onwards, with the hydrogen bomb, mankind really had the capacity to completely destroy itself. Now, you could say that took place with Hiroshima, with the fission bomb, but the hydrogen bomb just is at a completely new level. And these countries having, particularly the Soviet Union and the United States, having a nuclear arsenal full of hydrogen bombs, and this is just a destructive capacity that is just beyond imagination. And this might have been a time when we started to develop a new fear, and it is the fear of nuclear destruction. And if you think about the 1980s, I remember the 1980s. As I just said, I was at the London School of Economics talking about Stalin, and I remember when I was student, every autumn one would go on a CND march. That was just a kind of standard thing. Every autumn there was a CND march in London. There were always lots of people there, and it wasn't just about marching for the sake of it, marching for something that has nothing to do with me. People were genuinely concerned about nuclear destruction. It wasn't just some idle thought. It was some fantasy. No, it could really have happened, and people were really worried about it. And that was a growing fear, and it had been a fear since you think about sort of the Aldermaston marches in the UK. I think they were in the sort of early 60s. That's what people were worried about. And then you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1989. Collapse of Russia. The communism in Russia collapsed a little bit later, but suddenly it was all over. People were no longer worried about nuclear destruction, and they needed to find something else to be worried about. And so you might argue that with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1989, the fear of nuclear destruction ended, and we started to get worried about something else. And if you are a climate change skeptic, I'm not, by the way, but if you are, you could say that suddenly society got worried about climate change and environmental destruction, global warming. The reason being because we had to be worried about something. Now we were no longer worried about nuclear destruction, then we had to be worried about the climate. And so what might now be happening with this Saturn-Neptune conjunction happening early next year, or indeed it's starting now, people are going to stop worrying about climate change. That's not going to be people's number one fear anymore. I think possibly it should be people's number one fear, but people are going to start worrying about something else. And it might be that they're going to start worrying about nuclear destruction all over again. We don't know. But it could be that Uranus is going into Gemini. There always is that warning that America might find itself at war. We don't know what's going to happen in Russia. We don't know what's going to happen as a result of the Ukraine conflict. From what I can see, Russia seems to be really winning that war, and it could be over in a year's time. But whatever happens in Ukraine, Saturn and Neptune, we should be looking for a new fear. And I'm just suggesting that it might not be the climate anymore. You think of sort of Greta talking about the climate a few years ago, but already people are sort of not so worried about the climate. I mean, people are talking about it, but ordinary people, I think they perhaps are more worried about their everyday lives. I think they should be worried about the environment, but they're not. So I think that is a way in which the Saturn-Neptune conjunction could be working. And I do have more to say about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, but actually I think I've said enough. And we shouldn't forget that this is work in progress. That the Saturn-Neptune conjunction doesn't become exact again until early next year. And where is it? So the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, here it is. It's on February the 20th, 2026. So end of February, that's when we really get it. And we'll start to get an idea about what it's all about. So just in this video, I just wanted to come up with a few ideas about how we might want to think about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.